Hello, good evening, everyone. We'll just wait for a minute before we begin. Welcome to this session on the post-budget reactions. Really excited for the conversations that we're about to have. Just allow us a couple of minutes before we begin. Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your patience. It's really wonderful to have all of you join in today and have our esteemed panel join in today. Before I introduce everyone, let me just give a little general introduction about myself and SafeEarth. So I'm Harshit and I'm one of the founders of SafeEarth. At SafeEarth, we're a team that's extremely passionate about accelerating India's growth to renewable energy. And in order to do that, we run a market network that helps EPC companies in growing their business and customers of solar in shifting to solar in the most easy and hassle-free manner. Today, we're here to essentially discuss the budget 24-25. In my personal opinion, this was a very significant budget. Over the last few months, there has been a lot of turmoil, a lot of changes, in particular about in the renewable energy industry, particularly in terms of the policies that are now in place. And given that, it felt like a very significant moment in terms of the country's long-term renewable energy targets. As a country, we've set very ambitious targets for the next decade. And these targets are essential for us to meet our net zero ambitions. So in order to meet these requirements, growing requirements, this budget was a significant budget in order to do so. Now, joining me today, we've got experts from various facets of the industry, people who have, who sit at various different vantage points and look at the entire space from multiple perspectives. So, for example, we have Swasti, who is working at IIFT. Now, Swasti Raisda, she's a policy advisor at the International Institute of Sustainable Development, wherein she leads the energy program. Her experience primarily lies in policy advisory and government affairs, and she currently leads ISD's work on mapping government support needed for clean energy technologies. So, given the topic of discussion, this becomes extremely significant, and the work that Swasti and her team are doing is extremely relevant to the conversation we're having. Swasti also advises governments on securing critical minerals and improving the preparedness of state-owned enterprises for the energy transition. Before joining IISD, she was with Deloitte, wherein she was looking after the energy and resource practice, advising multiple donors like the World Bank, climate investment funds, state electricity regulators, and distribution utilities on energy pricing. Swasti is also an active member of the Global Women's Network for Energy Transition and the South Asia Women in Energy. Swasti holds a master's in public policy, specializing in energy policy. So welcome today, Swasti. It would be lovely to hear a little from you about your work and your take on the budget.
Thanks, Ashit. And firstly, congratulations on I think convening all of us, and thank you for having me here. It's a delight to actually sit down and discuss this topic at hand with multiple experts, and also just like the work that SafeEarth is doing. I think it's just fantastic the kind of network that you've built on your platform. Um, I'll just probably build some context in terms of the work we do because I know you've already introduced it, but I'm here and the kind of work that we do could be interesting for some of the audiences. So I'll just lay out the land and then just provide my three takeaways, I think, from the budget. So at ISG's energy program, what we've been doing for the last 2 years is we've been looking at government support and India's needs to meet its own 2030 clean energy targets. And for this, we look at solar PV, but we also look at other technologies like electric vehicles, green hydrogen, offshore wind, and battery storage. Now, what's interesting is that because of the work we do, we are able to somewhat like tie the knots and connect the dots in a sense, right? In terms of when is support needed for which technology, where does each technology sit on the technology S curve, and how does that policy really evolve, and what are the kind of like barriers and challenges that the industry then faces, which then sort of mobilizes that kind of fiscal or non-fiscal support. So as a result, what happens is we study a lot of like these tariff, non-tariff barriers, which are very relevant for a sector like solar. Currently, we are doing a study which is almost like I think an year-long study, and we are almost like coming to the close of it, where we've interestingly looked at the deployment and manufacturing trade-offs for solar PV, which is like a question I think that we will get into deeper, I think, as the discussion evolves. So it's very pertinent in terms of the interplay of things like BCD, ALMM, and what that has in terms of the deployment manufacturing trade-offs for India. Now coming to the budget, I think this particular budget was pretty significant in terms of some of the sectors really showing a lot of resilience and maturity when it comes to how the center is looking at it. So I'll break it down into three key points. One, I think when we take an inside out view for India, what this means for especially a sector like solar, and which is what is coming out from the budget in terms of the macroeconomic signaling, is that there's definitely a clear focus for of the government in terms of pushing solar manufacturing just in general, which can then lead to job creation. And this ties back to what the big headline of the budget was, even when the interim budget came out earlier this year in February, that India's future growth is going to be anchored in green growth. And I think that's an important message to just lay out in terms of the kind of job opportunities it will create, but also in terms of what that means, not just from a deployment standpoint, but also from a manufacturing standpoint. The clear evidence of this is visible from, if you look at MNRE's budget, it's jumped significantly, almost 110 times. And this is mainly being led by the new PM Surya Ghar Muft Bijli Yojana, which has now been announced uh, earlier this year again. The government has allocated around 6,250 crores this year, but the overall outlay of the scheme is much higher, around 75,000 K. So this is a massive flagship program of the government, and the government is actually relying a lot on its success for 2030 now on this particular scheme. So I think going forward, residential will is already becoming a focus, but I think it's going to become an even bigger focus. That's one of the big trends, I think, that we can see from the budget for sure. The second very simple evidence of this would be how the government has embedded employment linked incentives into, which is the ELI is now somewhat the new PLI, if I could put it like that. But I think what this really means is that the government is actually thinking about incentives to lead to more job creation, and with a specific focus on especially women-led enterprises. I think this is again a positive news because we know that solar is a business that's sustainable in its very nature, and if you uh, overlap the social aspect of it, then it becomes an even bigger priority for governments, right? So then that's again like overall messaging that's coming out from the budget, and that is somewhat of a message to be picked on by the manufacturing sector also within solar. Um, in terms of specific measures for solar sector itself, the three key ones that we picked on, and I think a lot of that will be covered by other speakers as well, which is there's a 10% custom duty on solar glass imports, which will then kick in from October. And I think this is also an interesting thing that we can talk about in much detail later. But I think it's been a learning in terms of not being um, providing a little bit of policy uncertainty and a time and a window when you switch the policy, and which is, I think, what is interesting as a takeaway also, that the government has allowed some period for this to be absorbed, although the impact is going to be marginal possibly on the module pricing because of this. But then that's something that the government has accounted for, at least in the announcement that's come out. Similarly, there's a new custom duty on tin copper interconnect for manufacture of solar cells and modules. And I think for both of these, India does have a certain kind of domestic self-sufficiency, so the impact may not be as high as in terms of like some of the other custom duties that have been running for some time. Um, the third point I think that I'll broadly point out in terms of that inside out view is there is again a very interesting measure that the government has taken in terms of duty exemptions for equipment for cell manufacturing and module manufacturing. I think which is again something that can incentivize a lot of manufacturing and promote that within the country, especially on the equipment needed for manufacturing of silicon wafers. Um, so I think those are all positives in terms of inside out view. In terms of if you look at the part B of the budget, which is also a little bit on the tax incentives and some of the custom duty exemptions that the government has brought in, what this also shows is that India's green growth is anchored within this outside in view as well, which means that India is readying itself in terms of tapping into the global opportunity emerging from the China plus one policy. And I think that's very important to highlight, because while we're pushing for manufacturing and also putting in these non-tariff barriers in the form of ALMM plus GCR, this is not in a vacuum of sorts. India is very cognizant of the opportunity that's emerging from the US, especially with its China plus one policy and the tariff barriers that are now being imposed in the US as well for Chinese imports. And that is trickling down in terms of a major impact. If you look at the numbers, India's solar module exports have increased by 91% just in the last fiscal year. And that's emerging because of some of these package of measures that are being adopted by India. And finally, my third and final point would be that I think from the budget, one of the big takeaways was that this budget is not about piecemeal interventions. It's actually talking about a lot of economy wide transformations as well, which are somewhat subtle messaging. And there's a lot that still needs to come out. So we'll have to wait and watch in terms of what that means. But there was a clear message that the government is considering a climate finance taxonomy. And I think that's a big lever. If there is a clear taxonomy for mobilizing green finance and climate finance, that can have a major multiplier effect in terms of how financial products are innovated, how those are rolled out in the market. And similarly, the government has talked about designing clear sectoral transition pathways. And I think that's another big piece, which we'll have to wait and watch in terms of how the government decides to do that. But I think those are things that were pending for quite some time. And this budget has brought them to this front and center of the mainstream dialogue. And I think that's overall a really positive signal. I'll pause there. I'm happy to take any questions in the second half.
Thank
Back
you.
to you, Harshit.
Thank you so much, Swasti. There is, in fact, a lot of questions in my mind, but yes, we'll come down to that shortly. Let me now introduce our second speaker, which is Preetham Doshi. Now, Preetham leads Quark Solar, which is one of the EPC companies that that I personally hold in very high regards. At Quark, Preetham has not just built a leading and exceptional EPC company, but he's also built a very professional and quality centered organization. Today, Quark is growing tremendously in the EPC space, primarily because of the reputation that it has established for itself as a leading solar EPC company, specifically in India. Outside of Quark, Preetham has worked and led multiple organizations in marketing, distribution, and manufacturing. Preetham is a graduate of the Chicago Booth School of Business and University of Pennsylvania. Preetham's sharp and deep thinking has always positioned him as an industry leader in our industry of renewable energy. Now, without much ado, Preetham, over to you. Please tell us a little about the work that Quark is doing, and in particular, how does this budget impact the renewable energy industry? Over to you, Preetham.
Thank you. Thank you, Harshit. It's great to be here, and thank you for having me on the panel. Quark Solar is started in 2010. We got into the solar business before it was commercially welcome, so to say, as a technology. And we deployed some grid utility scale plants. In 2012, we also invested in solar manufacturing in 2008, actually, with copper, indium, gallium, deselenide panels. But we sold those businesses and we focused on the EPC and O&M business, specifically catering to commercial and industrial customers across India. And we do both ground mounted and rooftop plants. And we're also doing hybrid plants going forward. So that's a quick background. I think overall, it's hard to add to what Swasti already mentioned. I think overall the budget has been very positive for EPC companies. And primarily overall, it's added to the stability, right? It's added to visibility that was not there a few years ago. You would have policies that were changing, you would have tariffs that were introduced and then rescinded and then again introduced. So that kind of waffling or flip-flopping was a challenge for anybody, including our customers who would invest in solar plants and see if the returns were going to be long term or not. So it was hard for our customers, and these are large customers who want to take a long term strategy on energy transition themselves. So this particular budget has been useful in providing that stability. It's given more sort of strength to domestic manufacturing. It's sort of reduced import duties or eliminated import duties for the capital manufacturing goods. And I think overall, it's just given that push towards fighting climate change, and I think that's a plus for all of us. Having said that, I think the overall policy that the government has taken of protecting or encouraging domestic module manufacturing has been probably long-term good, but it has sort of increased the cost of input for some of our projects, which has led to sort of increase in investment for our customers and our developers, right? So that's something that is on sort of the short term or sort of a myopic view in terms of increase in investment. And also the increase in import duties or exemption that's been removed for glass and sort of the tin copper interconnect will incrementally increase the prices of panels domestically until we see the domestic glass manufacturers increase their capacity several fold. There have been several of the manufacturers in the pipeline that are adding multiple gigawatts of capacity, but it's probably not.
Have we lost him?
Yeah, I think we've lost
I
him.
think so.
Let's give it a second.
Yes. I just was wondering whether is it my internet or is it Preetham's internet? Thank you for the. Okay, I think while Preetham's here. Preetham, can you hear me? You're muted.
Sorry, I don't know where I got disconnected, but overall, it's been a welcome budget for solar EPC companies, and happy to get into details in subsequent questions.
No,
we
I
should
think the point that
definitely
you-
expand this. Yeah, we should definitely expand on this increased costs and what are the implications on
In fact,
how
that's
it
where we've
impacts the
got
local
most of our
markets. Yeah.
questions. Yeah, that's where most that I think that's the we'll definitely dive deeper into this. But
Yeah.
Preetham, I think the way you summarized it, very, very a very, very balancing act. Definitely, that's a very wonderful perspective to look at it, and we'll definitely dive deeper into that. But I would like to first introduce Arun and also hear from him. Now, Arun is the head of green finance at Eximpe, where he's primarily looking at trade finance and essentially the green elements of trade finance. Arun has been a startup leader for more than 2 decades now. He has led growth, marketing, and communications for various innovative companies, including Fasos, Woopler, and Printo. However, Arun is extremely passionate about climate tech and climate action, and this has prompted him to look at opportunities in the climate space over the past few years. Today, he looks at financing, green financing in particular at Eximpe, because ultimately financing is a key element of the climate solution. Now, Arun has started working at EximPay over the last few years. However, the plethora of experience that he's gathered in this time is commendable. Specifically working with with SMEs across India. So yeah, without now much ado, Arun, over to you. Would love to hear from you a little about your experience and how do you view this budget?
Yeah, thanks, Harshit. I think just a quick background about me, right? Having worked within growth across companies, and I've worked with larger companies also, right? Aircel, Naukri.com, HCL, having driven logistics, etc. For product management across these organizations, have been central to a lot of these organizations and really building businesses. I understand the entrepreneur's language really well. I might not be a specialist on finance necessarily. I wouldn't claim myself to be. I've gotten into finance over the last 1 year for an interesting reason. Philosophically, I realized that money runs the world. If you really want to influence the world, you need to start finding ways to influence the capital. And one of my, let's say, diabolical goals is to see how to really bring the significant amount of capital that is focused on sustainability across the world into India, right? So very interesting insight that I found was India has maybe 1% of the world's financial assets. Now, fundamentally, if you say that if you have a house, you can only leverage your house to a certain percentage, right? You can't leverage beyond that. And so the ability to really source financing for India, I think one of the constraints for India is this, that that top line ability for us to raise money is challenging right now, and the government is doing a significant number of programs. Before coming to the budget, is that so for example, green deposits within the green finance as a tool for banks and NBFCs and financial institutions to go raise money. Has been a method for raising concessional capital, which is then deployed by a SIDBI, NABARD, etc., into green finance, green financing, and green sectors and projects to give access to substantially cheaper capital, right, relative to what market rates are. So there is a lot of initiatives from the government's perspective into accessing a lot of this global capital, and that is something that I'm really keenly looking forward to and seeing how that money is coming in. Coming to like I said, so capital is key to growth. Like Harshit said, that it says it just continues from there, and so that is one area of my focus. And the second thing, over the last 3-4 years, I'd spent very aggressively studying what the sustainability problems were. It came funnily because a friend of mine sent her daughter to a Greta Thunberg supporting campaign, right? I was a little annoyed. I'm not a climate alarmist. I think that humanity has the ingenuity and creativity necessary, given the right circumstances, to go out and solve problems. It's as simple as that. So I'm a climate. So what I call myself as a climate opportunist, and it's important to position yourself somewhere, right? I'm looking at the opportunities to really grow. I keep pushing a lot of people into climate jobs nowadays, and that's one of my primary things that I go out and do. And I think a lot more people need to come into these sectors. The future of all jobs, every job is going to have a climate-linked parameter, right? So in the next decade, and that's going to be a default. Every job, be it a marketer, be it a operations guy, everybody's going to have a mandate. So every job in the future is a climate job, and every business is going to be a climate business, right? Today, we have a restricted view of what a climate business looks like, but the opportunity is to look at an expanded way, right? So fundamentally, my thesis, personal thesis for my career, is that I'm looking at sustainability and finance as core to what I'm looking at for the next 20 years, 30 years, I don't know where. But that's moving away from a growth and marketing and kind of role. So today, most of what I do is finance and sales. So that's That's a big shift for me and a lot to learn. But I'm enjoying this and I'm passionate. I'm passionate about this to go out and solve this. Coming to the budget, right? Very interestingly, and I'm going to talk primarily from the finance and money perspective again. One of the mandates that the budget really had was to take a little bit of the momentum away from the stock markets. A lot of money was going into F&O, derivatives, mutual funds, equity, and there is a lot of fluff within that space. There's a extreme, the valuations are off the hook. I'm happy seeing my mutual funds grow, but I think it is not good in the long term for the economy. One of the impacts that's happened is that over the last 1 year, we've seen the deposits to banks, which is one of the cheapest sources of money that a bank has, dropped by 1.6%. And that means that when banks struggle for access to capital, they'll not be able to deploy monies much more efficiently and easily. So that's put some pressure on banks across interest rates, and there is additionally there is a pressure to slow down personal loans and retail loans, which means that, so I'll give you an interesting number. SME advances or loans are only 16% of the overall advances of banks that they're deploying, right? That means 84% is going into two sectors, which is large corporates and retail. There is a massive mandate that the government has to shift the 16% to 25%, which is also reflected within the one of the priority focuses for the government, and one of the priority focuses is MSME, right? Now, with the drop in pressure to grow personal loans, there is only one way for all these banks and PSUs to really go deploy money, and that's going to be the MSME sector. Which, to put it simply, should directly impact access to cash for MSMEs, access to credit, which should, given the mandate on the energy sector, directly imply that you should have more financing for solar assets deployment, right? And so that money is coming in two fronts. One is coming for the residential, the other is coming for the commercial and other establishments. So the other big intervention, I think, was interesting that I saw that the finance minister spoke about investment grade energy audits. Now, a lot of the MSMEs are not able to raise financing because they have a financial discipline problem, etc., which should get sorted with this deployment, which further is an accelerator. So two things that I see, MSMEs being able to drive a lot of this solar adoption or renewable energy adoption is this, that the things like the energy audit and things like the the access to capital and credit guarantees, etc., coming into MSMEs. That's one of the key ideas that I follow, and so I'd be happy to kind of really go more deeper into it while on customs duty and other things. Swasti is a specialist, and on the manufacturing and the solar bit, Preetham is a specialist. The other thing that I might be able to kind of contribute to is I understand China really well, and I'll be able to maybe add some inputs there. So happy to take questions on China and China's growth and how they look at the world and how they look at the green energy space. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arun. Now, before we move to the Q&A, I'd like to summarize, the discussion that we've had. Some brilliant points were raised, and in fact, given that all for three panelists sit at very different vantage points, it's really interesting to see, their unique perspectives. In the meantime, though, I'd like to just let our audience know that we do have you can there's a code that you will see on each of our screens. You can very easily scan that code, and any questions that you have, you may shoot that there. You can also upvote on different questions that others may have asked, and the questions that receive the maximum upvotes, we will definitely try and address those. But yeah, without now much ado, let me give a holistic summary of what was discussed. So firstly, I do believe that this budget has done tremendously well for
The residential solar space, as Swasti said, Surya Ghar Yojana is a massive program for this government. It not only addresses the need for growth of solar, not only addresses solar, but also empowers, I would say, the economically weaker sections of our society, provides them with a very basic necessity required for quality of life. And definitely, this can be a massively critical program for the country. Then, holistically, we also saw and discussed that if you see over the last 3 years, there has been a conscious strategy of sorts to boost India's domestic manufacturing. And that is a long-term capability that, while may have short-term price impacts, is absolutely essential for the country to become a leading solar hub. And as Preetham pointed out, that this sits in well with the this ultimately balances the entire this budget balances the entire policy over the last few years. In particular, also, this is India essentially tapping into the China plus one policy, specifically seen from the growth in module exports, which are up 91%. This budget also laid out certain critical points for the MSME sector. And in particular, I believe Arun's point on the influx of capital in our stock markets versus the fall of capital essentially in every other asset class. I think that's a very interesting perspective. And that's something that I had personally not thought of, particularly from the taxation perspective. But now looking back, that's actually a very interesting point. And that's something that we'd love to deep dive into. Thank you so much, panelists, for your wonderful viewpoints. Now, I would like to move ahead with specific questions. And in particular, I would like to first, I have a question first for Preetham. Now, essentially, if you see over the last, 5 odd years or 10 odd years, residential solar has been more in terms of absolute number of installations and sort of lesser in terms of the quantum of or the kilowattage of installation. And CNI solar is, our industries are consuming 70% of our power. So CNI solar is a leader in terms of the total solar deployed. Now we've set ourselves a target of 1 crore homes. That's a massive number. So Preetham, what is your expectations? How does this target really flip our goals as a country, our trends as a country?
I think, I think if I remember correctly, for several years, various states have had subsidies for solar installations. Those subsidies went away for CNI segment and they continued for the residential segment. And because it was a state level issue, these subsidies were very inefficiently allocated and inefficiently deployed or disbursed. What this program has done is it's basically sort of put a goal for everyone to achieve, which is 1 crore homes, 75,000 crores to be invested or deployed by the government. And it's basically aligned all the states, the discoms, it's sort of brought in visibility and transparency to the system. They have a portal where anybody can register with their documentation, and then you would be sort of allotted your application would be then considered and then approved, and then EPC guy would come and install it, and then you would claim your subsidy thereafter. Or this whatever the Yojana disbursement. So I think that's really helped. It will definitely accelerate the residential contribution to total rooftop installations across India, both in terms of numbers, of course, but also in terms of kilowatts. I think one thing that I do have a bit of a sort of putting on my engineering hat, and I'm thinking, why did they want to install so many disparate systems? Why would not they just put on 75,000 crores, put off 25 gigawatts of solar in different states, and then distribute it using the discoms and discoms information, put up a portal, give it to, understand who are the BPL homes, and then give them 300 units straight on the bill, right? So that 25,000 megawatts or 25 gigawatts, and that 75,000 crores would go a long way versus putting 3 kilowatt systems on every home, because that's very inefficient. Now, if you say, yeah, okay, environmentally, this is great, but it's even better socially, because you're giving so much employment to various EPC guys and contractors and civil guys and all of that. So I think putting on my sort of governance hat, I would say it makes a lot of sense to do it this way. It's more inefficient, but it adds to jobs, it adds to employment, and sort of also it adds to sort of the political angle that I'm doing good for a crore families, and this is a tangible touch and feel asset that they can get on their rooftop. So, but yeah, no, it's going to definitely move the needle for residential solar in this country big time.
And do you see this ultimately helping the residential solar market become a bigger market opportunity than the CNI space? I mean, if for someone starting out a new EPC company today, right, what would you suggest them to focus on given these new trends?
So I think it really depends on what the entrepreneur wants to do. I think the residential solar market is phenomenal for small, regional, local entrepreneurs who have, a radius of 100 kilometers, right, that they want to service. It's phenomenal because they can get to that home quickly to service, troubleshoot, and all of that. If the goal is to go national or even multi-state, I think targeting the residential solar market is not easy. I think some of the players in that market who were the CNI segment players and moved to residential, but it's really hard to scale up beyond 1 or 2 states. It takes a lot of money, a lot of manpower, and a lot of branding.
Right. My next question is actually for you, Arun. So Arun, what you briefly mentioned on the change in taxation from the perspective of the capital flow that's happened over the last few years. Now, how do you see this change in taxation in particularly impacting the renewable energy industry, and in particular impacting solar financing?
So by taxation, what did you mean again? Sorry.
I mean, the change in long-term capital gains, the change in personal income tax. How does that have an impact now for our industry?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's going to be largely a short-term impact in the short to medium term. Like I said, the markets are overheated to that extent. And some amount of that cash needs to come back. So, for example, see, banks fundamentally run on our monies, right? The deposits that we would put to the banks, that's the cheapest source of its capital. You get 8%, but they deploy it at 11, 12%, and make a 4%, right? Net interest margin. Now, if they're not getting access to cheap capital, they struggle to then, be more operationally profitable, efficient, etc. Now, in the long term, no, I think the policy, there is some questions around, should we keep the LTCG at that level? We have some of the highest long-term capital gains or the capital gains taxes across the world. Will it be changed? I don't know. This government, given the current pressures that it has, that it needs to be seen as more populist. It needs to it needs to find all the capital it can, right? I think some of the great things that the government has done, being able to grow GST revenues, etc. Incomes, they got a massive bounty in terms of their Reserve Bank surplus. Those are all positives, right? The cash coming in, the question is for banks, right? How do they get capital to be able to go out and deploy? That's the primary constraint that I was talking about, right? So they need, like I said, India is fundamentally only 1% of the world's financial assets. Where do they get the monies to go and deploy? And that's an important question for the government also to answer. So from the green energy sector perspective, like I said, right? So the green deposits program is one source of capital that the government has given the PSUs and banking institutions to raise money. They can raise money through whatever sources that they want. Green deposits are green bonds, right? They can raise the money from anywhere. It comes at a concessional rate. They can then start deploying that wherever they want to, right? And in which I think clearly solar is the mandate in terms of the highest priority of focus. So I think along with the focus on the MSME prioritization that the government has done, which is going to become a pressure on PSUs to deliver, and also private sector banks, right? So one of the interventions that the government has done, and I'm shifting now to the MSME perspective, right, where the cash is going to come in, or the financing is going to come in. In terms of the credit programs that's been assigned for the MSMEs, so if you see micro and small enterprises have got some additional benefits in terms of being able to go out and raise financing that the government's given. The credit guarantee scheme's been extended, and there's been some benefits there. And on top of that, also, this larger focus. So one of the big things is the mandate that the government has given to all the banks to build their own credit underwriting programs and credit rating programs, and not be dependent on a CRISIL or the likes, right? Which brings down cost. And also, they've asked for more digitization in this approach, right? Which are all indicators that there is a digitalization pressure, which will make these monies more accessible. And like I said, the other point, right, in terms of credit access, if your energy audits are being done at investment grades, I still have to understand what that means, because there is no expansion on that idea. But fundamentally, if that is done, it seems like a great mechanism for banks. Today, banks are averse, really. So here is one way a bank thinks, right? A bank looks at almost everything as assets or cash flows, right? If you have positive, profitable cash flows, or if you have assets on your books, great, I'll give you money. I'll give you a certain leverage on top of that. If you don't, you basically don't get any monies, right? And that's where most of the MSME sector struggles to find access to financing. And so the digitalization benefit, plus this access to this pressure for banks to go out and push more MSME financing, plus this new credit rating mechanism, should all sum up to MSMEs becoming more credit worthy, and thus access to more financing. So I wouldn't look at the taxation on LTCG, having any long-term impact, because the India story is very bullish. The multipliers are still there. So nobody in their right mind who has the money is not going to put their money anywhere else other than India. And with China being, you can't put money in China. You can't put money in a lot of different places that China has a certain influence on. So the US has a preference to US or Europe or Japan, wherever the money is. There's only one place to really that money to come. That's India, right? And so there is a good structure, I think, that the good roadmap the government has put in place for all this capital to flow in more seamlessly, which means more growth, and which I think also the MSMEs are going to be the biggest beneficiaries of.
Definitely, that seems fairly interesting, and I think helping boost the MSME sector and helping them shift to clean tech is something essential, because one of the trends that outside of this conversation that we've also seen coming up is that today all of the large importers in the developed countries are looking to reduce their Scope 3 emissions. So if Indian MSMEs are by their very nature much more sustainable, environmentally speaking, then I believe that is going to not just help them in meeting their environmental obligations, but it's also going to be fabulous for their business. Now, Swasti, I have one question that I have been really waiting to hear your perspective on, which is on the overall Indian energy mix. Now, this was in fact the first budget wherein we saw so much discussions around small-scale nuclear reactors. A couple of years back, green hydrogen was a major area of focus. And of course, solar's been going on for a while. So now, sitting from your vantage point, how do you see the India energy mix evolving over the next 10 years? Specifically, given the fact that we're also trying to boost our manufacturing capabilities domestically. So, how do you see the entire energy mix evolve over the next decade and beyond?
Sure. Thanks, Harshit. I mean, like it's a very important question that you asked. I can probably comment on, what the government itself has put out. All of us can differ in terms of that energy mix because I think only time will tell where we land.
Of
But if you
course.
look at Central Electricity Authority's optimal generation mix report, which came out in the summer last year, they're looking at a target of around 293 gigawatts of deployment for solar PV by 2030. And solar is going to play a major role in terms of reaching our what are called the intended nationally determined contributions, the NDCs of India, where India has committed to installing 50% of its where India has committed to ensuring that its cumulative electric installed capacity is met at least 50% by non-fossil fuels by 2030. And when we say non-fossil fuels, we are thinking about nuclear as well. So I know you touched upon it. So therefore, it does play a role in India's energy mix. Having said that, I think there's a lot at play. So if you look at what India's been supporting in terms of just direct transfers also from the budget, we've been doing it all. That's the short answer to it. I don't think we have we're doing both fossil and clean at the same time because our energy demand is increasing rapidly. And there's a catch up game that we need to play, right? While renewables is picking up pace, it's barely able to meet from a generation standpoint the additional demand that's coming out,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a catch up game that's happening right now in the energy mix where we are speeding up in terms of solar deployment. But if I have to give my personal opinion, it needs to be ramped up much faster than where we are in order to get to that 293 gigawatt of 2030 goal. Just to put a new few stats in there. So last year we saw growth in terms of deployment of 23% on in terms of capacity addition. If India has to reach from here to the 293 goal, we have to ensure that we at least stick to this growth rate of 23%. Otherwise, we will not get to that target. And there, decentralized RE will play a major role because utility scale solar has land constraints. And there's already a roadmap almost laid out till 2027. But if you look at, and also MNRE has come out with a bidding trajectory where we are trying to bid out at least 50 gigawatt every year. And now, having said that, in terms of deployment targets, given the pressures that Preetham also mentioned in the short term, this could become tricky for India. So from 2024 to 2027 will be a period to watch out for because I think if there is a price pressure, especially in the next 2 years, then that could have a severe impact in terms of India being able to reach 293 of solar. Now, what happens if we don't get to that target? If we don't get to that target, there is a natural answer in terms of looking at other types of energy mixes, right? Which is where now maybe that's the signaling that's coming out from the budget, where we are now expanding into looking at nuclear. We are even adding thermal still. If I could point that out, right? In the budget, the government has explicitly mentioned that it's going to support a new thermal power plant in Bihar. There's another R&D support that's been given to an NTPC and BHEL joint venture in terms of putting out an advanced ultra supercritical thermal power plant of 800 megawatts. So we are still pushing for that at the same time because of this rising demand. We could get into a lot more detail in terms of, what this means because this is happening at a time when battery storage costs are also declining at the same pace as solar PV modules, right? We are seeing a 60% decline happen in terms of just battery prices. So I think there's a lot of solutioning that India needs to do in terms of ensuring that, we have a ramped up deployment with what is called firm dispatchable RE, FDRE solutions, because that's creating another argument whether we should be building out thermal at all compared to FDRE, because that's almost becoming commercial right now and even cheaper from thermal in that sense. But there's lots of political economy at play, I think. So not to dismiss, because in terms of maturity also, there are some states that are laggards, some states that are leaders, and therefore you have to look at the overall equity perspective also in terms of where thermal is coming versus where FDRE solutions are coming. And I think that's the holistic thinking that India is bringing, at the central level at least. And it's trying to create that balancing act of trying to do all based on who the winners and losers are. So there is an underlying equity problem there, I think, which we are also trying to address through some of this. But long story short, India's solar story is pretty strong in terms of even energy mix up to 2030, with DRE playing a massive role. And this is not just residential rooftop, it's also things like PM Kusum, which is again another massive program of the government of India. And solarizing agriculture is going to play a very major role in terms of shifting that evening peak to the morning peak and solarizing it at the same time. So I think all of those are just like overall good policy interventions that I can say in terms of thinking about energy mix. But India will probably do all of it, is my answer.
With the way, with the points that you've raised, I think that's a totally separate one-hour webinar. I have so many questions to ask you. But in fact, one of the things that one of our audiences asked was around the fact that China deployed 17 gigawatts of solar this month. India's total deployment in the last 10 odd years is at about 85 gigawatts, and we do expect it to do about 50 this year. So essentially, China is deploying in a quarter what India would have deployed in a year. Now, how do we play catch up? And I would love to hear three strong actionables from each one of you. What are 3 ways that you think we could catch up to those levels? Whoever would like to go first, please go ahead. Yeah, Preetham, please.
So I'll take the low-hanging fruit first. So one is obviously land acquisition. 17 gigawatts in a month, right? I mean, that's just insane pace. Forget the construction of the plant. I'm just talking about land acquisition. That itself is phenomenal. So I think somehow we need to figure that out. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we are a group of a federation of states, and every state is different, and every state has its own policy for approvals, et cetera, et cetera. So I think overall, land acquisition approvals, from the discoms, from the gencos, and from the state government needs to be super streamlined. We're talking about interstate transmission line that'll help. We can probably find a way to bypass a lot of those approvals and centralize some of them, but those are only for the big boys. But I think yeah, that's we just have to streamline land acquisition and approvals. And I think that's the bottleneck, and everything else will follow because everything else is market driven.
Right. Swasti, Arun, would either one of you like to go next?
I can again come in on one intervention, but I would love to hear from Arun in terms of what his unpacking is of how China is doing it, because I can't comment on that.
Yeah.
But I think if India has to do it, I think firstly, we also need to recognize that there are some major states which need to also catch up. So far, the capacity that is coming up is coming from top 10 leading states of in terms of RE deployment, I think, of India. But there are lots of states that are still playing a catch-up game, and there's absence of the market from even like the presence of integrators, the market development that needs to happen there. If you go to states like Chhattisgarh and you interact with the discoms there, Jharkhand is another example, Bihar is another example. The government is trying to push for what is called an integrated resource planning to then help create the evidence of what role solar can play in their own power mix. But that kind of evidence is currently missing, which is where there is a little bit of reluctance, I see it, from some of these states. Northeast is again great potential, but we haven't seen a lot of deployment happen in some of these states at all, right? So I mean, like, if these states get added in terms of the kind of work that has been happening in the top 10 leading states, we could see a major significant shift in terms of what's happening. And then second point I would like to emphasize is there's a major role that India's public sector utilities need to play here, because in energy has historically been a sector which is dominated by India's PSUs, right? So think about NTPC, SJVNL, and we are seeing that happen in the last 2 years since they've been given the Renewable Energy Implementation Agency status. There is a bidding calendar, as I mentioned previously, that's been put out. So now it's almost become a carrot and stick approach for PSUs, right? And I think that could be a major game changer because the kind of tender trajectory that they're coming out with, there could be a lot more development that can happen, which was not the case 5 years back. So I'm a little optimistic in terms of what can happen from here in the next 3 years, given some of these measures that the government is taking. But I think we'll have to wait and see how that pans out, especially in the eastern states of India, northeast, and then what the PSUs also can do, because they are sitting on very strong balance sheets, and therefore there could be a lot of capital that can be unlocked basis their balance sheets. So yeah, I'll probably pause there.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Arun, over to you.
So I think Preetham and Swasti have given the India perspective on what we need to do, and I think clear points. There's nothing much. I'll tell you a few things about China and the Chinese solar businesses, right? And from there, I think we'll have some of the answers, some maybe additional answers, right? So let me start with this: that most of China's solar companies are bleeding. They're negative. They're sitting on large inventories and overcapacity, right? Now, and on top of that, there is substantial amount of investment going into new production centers and manufacturing, right? And this is China. And the number one point is that they're ready to let their companies bleed. They're ready to take collateral damage in terms of companies shutting down, who are getting PLIs and incentives and everything, right? Which today has reached a stage where they're sitting on this overcapacity, right? So if you see December 22, China's, the solar module, or I don't know if the cell pricing was at somewhere around 26 cents on the dollar, right? 26 cents per watt. And today it is around 14 cents per watt. And 2 years back, the market said that China is not going to be able to bring down the costs further, but they've substantially brought it down, right? And on top of that, one of the biggest markets for solar adoption continues to be China. And because of that, they're able to meet their renewable energy targets and goals that I think somewhere around 36% of their overall supply is today renewables, and it's accelerating towards 50% in the next 10, 15 years. And so they are putting in the substantial amount of monies to drive this. And on top of that, I'll tell you the second point is that they drive export subsidies to the extent of, I think, of 4 to 16%, I think somewhere on the top end of it. And these 4 to 16% gets refunded to you within 24 hours, right? So what we're seeing is, if you're importing from China, right? So we have an FX payments platform, right? So we see a lot of invoices coming in which have discounts for what? RMB payments, right? Yuan payments. So you receive payments in yuan. The Chinese government has a mandate to internationalize the yuan, and which drives for and these suppliers and if you're getting yuan payments, you're getting your export subsidies settled within 24 hours. To the extent that I've seen 10 minutes somewhere in one of these articles.
Wow.
So which means that you have access to these cash flows, right? Which allows them to be there. Now, if this is a shameless plug, if anybody wants to do, forex payments in yuan, please come to Eximpay. We'll help you out with that, right? That's second, the subsidizing the exports. And the number 3 big point is, so yesterday I was reading one of these large leaders, big leaders at China, and the speech that he gave. One of the most critical points that they talk about is innovation, right? So there is substantial amount of money is being pumped into R&D. China today pumps out the largest number of patents in the world. Their research to the extent that there is a reverse brain drain happening from US. A lot of Chinese are moving back into China. It is smart people at the top end. And very interestingly, the only people going into the US is poor Chinese immigrants, right? So this whole revision that's happening of people going back and building stuff in China is a big drive for innovation. So a lot of knowledge coming in. Now, none of these things we are doing, right? And with the so from a land acquisition perspective, one of the most interesting things is that in China it's super easy. Everything has a top-down agenda, right? The Central Planning Commission says that this is your target for this district, this region. The district then goes and gives a regional target, and everybody is kind of aligned on these growth incentives. We don't have that kind of alignment. We have a very different, social, be it social structure, be it, the federal structure that we operate on, and that limits our ability to be able to be as agile as the Chinese. And so we should ideally not benchmark ourselves to the Chinese. But yeah, I mean, to summarize, I think there is an opportunity. There is cheap inventory lying in China. I think this opportunity should be used to pull as much as we need, build our capacity, stockpile if necessary. Maybe that's a crazy idea, right? And get our solar energy growth happening. So that's what I think. But yeah.
Unfortunately, with ALMM coming in, we cannot really import from China. So yeah, I mean, at least most of the sort of projects that most of Indian
the
EPCs
counter
do.
view there is that 70 to 80% of supply still comes from China. I mean, I don't know what that view is. That's still not.
I think that numbers changed significantly in this quarter. But we're already sort of shooting time, so I want to address a few very good questions that have come up. Specifically, Preetham, for you, there has been an increase in import duties for glass as well as tin copper. How do you see the price of solar modules reacting in the short term in line with these, and how do you see them going about in the long term in reaction to these?
So I think just specifically on duties that have been imposed or the exemptions that have been lifted, etc. I think the short term, we're seeing maybe 10-15% of increase in module cost for our business. But I think in the long term, that should not have an effect because we are seeing more and more domestic glass manufacturing for solar coming online in terms of capacity. And we're also seeing, hopefully, more solar panel supplies coming online in terms of capacity as we speak. Hoping a lot of that production is allocated for domestic sale versus export, but it is an open market, and ultimately, the Western markets tend to give them a better price than sort of the Indian market. So they will end up having to have, they'll probably end up having substantial exports. But I think, again, like I said, overall, I see the market creeping up a little bit in the short term and then stabilizing thereabouts. Having said that, Arun, the price of panels from a Chinese maker for a export order of 50 megawatts.
I think we've dropped him again. He is making an important point.
Yes, I was keen to hear that myself.
We should make sure we get that number out.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I might be completely wrong. But anyways, I mean, the data on the research, I think Swasti,
Preetham's an absolute expert. Yeah.
Sorry.
We're glad to have you back. Yes.
So the complete panel, forget solar cells. We're seeing the complete panel is 9.3 cents FOB China. It's insane. It's just insane.
In fact, yes, we're seeing this increasingly today. The cost of doing a project anywhere outside of India, especially with Chinese models, is extremely low. However, a bulk of the world has sort of imposed some form of duties on imported solar modules, specifically from China, which is what has created this sort of opportunity for India. And in fact, this, in my opinion, is one significantly important foundational step that needs to be there in place, which is domestic manufacturing. And in fact, in our pre-budget webinar, one very interesting point was raised by this gentleman from Vikram Solar, that we actually need to now go beyond just supporting, creating capabilities for scale, but also provide some form of subsidies for research and development of solar modules. And I think that that could be one of the highest leverage activities that the government could do, because it's already done something similar in the MSME space. But now, in the interest of time, I want to have answered to ask two very specific questions, and let's try and keep it as a rapid fire in the interest of time. Now, in particular, what is, and once again, this is out there, anybody could answer. How do you foresee the growth of energy exchanges and retail electricity market, especially with the increase in wind and solar assets over the long term?
Tough question. It's about me.
Yeah, but I think Swasti and Preetham, this is right up your alley. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll leave it to Swasti. It's something to do with regulatory stuff as well. So I'm not an expert there.
Swasti, all of our most
Yeah.
difficult questions end up with you. Please go ahead.
I think there's no easy answer. But again, this is something that I think we'll have to wait and watch, because I think from 1st April, if I'm not wrong, the government has brought in another measure, which is the TOD tariff. And I think that could be a game changer, especially for CNI customers, because right now what happens in the retail market, at least, is we have a regulated pricing, right? So what happens is there is no price signal for solar hours and non-solar hours for the end consumer in terms of what that price discovery really means. Now, with a TOD tariff and smart metering, depending on the success of it and the adoption at the state level, if that happens, then there is a clear price signal for consumers to then think about alternatives. So because this mechanism is expected to has kicked from 1st April 2024, we'll have to wait and see how much of that creates an impact. But I see that also becoming one of those interventions that could potentially change consumer behavior at the on the residential side. On the exchange side, the market is definitely expanding. We are seeing a lot more like transactions in terms of volume and value both, especially with the adoption of more battery energy storage systems coming in. But we'll have to see again there, because in the way the bids are happening right now, your entire capacity is contracted to the best part, basically the off-taker, and you are not really allowed to sell in the open market, because they're trying to create more market stability and de-risk. So basically what is happening is that the government is taking on more risk than the private sector, and this is that so that the market really matures in terms of creating that structure properly. But in the future, that could become one of the transitions that can happen in terms of also best developers developing models where they're allowed to have like a significant volume that can be then put on merchant sale through exchanges. So we'll have to see in terms of how that market evolves. But I think in the short term, I wouldn't see a lot of things changing, at least for the next 1 to 2 years. That would be my reflection of it, but I could go wrong.
Thank you. So last question, and this is again for the entire room. Please feel free to answer it as you see fit. Yeah. So
if you don't ask tough questions, then we can answer.
No, this is a very easy one. This is about your perspective. What are you really excited about next in terms of the India energy story?
I think I can take that first quickly.
Please.
I think I come back to the MSME story, right? I think the biggest job creators, the biggest growth sectors are going to be in the MSME sector. For me, and I think today going solar is a no-brainer. It saves significant amounts on your bottom line over time, and the adoption is just going to be exponential I think it's a matter of time. There is some critical mass event that has to happen, and post that, I think this is exponential.
Right. Yeah. In fact, that's something that I'm also very excited about, the growth of solar in the MSME sector. And yeah, Arun, best of luck on trying to solve the most critical problem that exists in that space, which is finance. Yeah, Preetham, you were saying something.
I think for me, it would be sort of a healthy mix of different renewables and storage solutions, and sort of making them interchangeable at sort of flip of a switch and not sort of have any regulations in there. Because that's the most painful thing is, signing a piece of paper that says this is the capacity I've put up, and then that capacity is dedicated to X customer and not Y customer. And if the grid if I'm willing to pay grid charges, then I should be able to switch on the fly. So I'm hoping for lower regulation in the whole transmission distribution space. That's my hope. But I'm looking forward to a healthy mix of different technologies and storage, including pumped hydro, which is a big effort that they've pushed in this latest budget.
In fact, there have been a lot of questions about this, the energy mix. In fact, we've tried and address a few today, but I've largely stayed away from, because this is another 2-hour discussion on just where is the energy mix. In fact, based on the questions that we've received, our team has already discussed doing a webinar specifically on the future of India's energy mix, because that's, again, as I said, it's a 2-hour discussion. Swasti, over to you.
I apologize. I don't have anything novel. I think I'll agree with Preetham. For me, storage is the most exciting bit, because I think what's also interesting is how the policy will evolve around this, especially given the market development that has happened. Because I see storage as where solar was 10 years back today, where prices are crashing. The developers possibly don't need any kind of support for deployment. There is a VGS scheme that's running. So what is next in terms of that? Because there's jumping that's happening even with batteries. So the policy reaction of the government to that, at least on the battery energy storage system, is going to be very interesting to watch out for. But because of the solutioning that the renewable energy sector is doing with batteries along with renewables, that's a really positive story, because that's that's load following, it's firm, it's dispatchable, and that can just completely turn around India's energy mix by 2030. So I'm most excited about that, also because I think from a policy perspective, it's very fascinating how we'll then balance the deployment and manufacturing trade-offs there as well.
Yeah, I think just one of the things that one of the really exciting things that I've done in the last couple of months has been attend this seminar on battery manufacturing in India. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's like exactly where solar was 10 years back. We have some sort of manufacturing in house, but it's we essentially trying to build everything on the fly, and we've done that at solar, relatively speaking. And I believe it'll be very interesting to see how storage goes. Just one quick follow-up. When you say storage, what are some of the technologies that you're keeping a track on?
So we are currently looking only on batteries. We haven't looked at pumped hydro because we don't do hydro actually, and nuclear, 2 technologies we don't do deeper research on. But batteries is definitely a focus, both short duration and long duration. And we're looking at all kinds of solutioning there, FDRE, standalone, all of that. Yeah.
Thank you so much to all our panelists. We're already overshot by 10 minutes. Let me take
quick question
Yes.
to Swasti. How much of the batteries are coming from China today?
Universal, which is why I said it's like 10 years, solar 10 years back. So that's precisely going to become the next question, right? Deployment manufacturing, because we also have a PLI for ACC. So then what's the trade-off? Like, where are we going? That becomes
in fact, the amount of work happening in battery manufacturing in India, I mean, cell manufacturing in India, it's remarkable.
It's
I mean,
remarkable.
just look at the plans of Amar Raja, look at the plans of Exide. I mean, I believe they will be significant global players in the years to come. Really excited to see where that heads. Let me first take this opportunity to thank all 3 of you for taking out time today and for this really insightful discussion. We will be sharing the recording of this webinar on YouTube, as well as sharing our synopsis of this very shortly. Thanks to all of our audience for attending. Hope you all have a wonderful weekend. And once again, a special thanks to our panelists for taking our time today and for sharing their insights with us on the budget and on the future growth of renewables in India. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Harshit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harshit, for having us and bringing this session
together. It was
together.
an absolute pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to all the people who listen to us. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.